Good morning, class 6. Today we will be continuing with history, the third chapter, in the earliest cities. Let's begin. Saving an old building. Okay, first tell me one thing, that we are living in our houses. Can you just sit and imagine, like maybe 3,000, 4,000 years back, who was living there in this area or in the area where you are living, how they might have been living there, what was the, their lifestyle, their mode of recreation, how they managed their lives, what they ate, what they wore. Isn't it interesting if you come to know that these type of people used to live here? These were the houses they were living in. Isn't it interesting? Yes, so that is what we are going to study today. Let's see. Saving an old building. Jaspal and Harpreet were playing cricket in the lane outside their home when they noticed the people who were admiring the dilapidated old building that the children called the haunted house. "Look at the architecture," said one of the men. "Have you seen the fine wood carving?" asked one of the women. "We must write to the minister so that she makes arrangements to repair and preserve this beautiful house." Why, they wondered, would anybody be interested in the old run-down house? So here two children, Jaspal and Harpreet, they were playing cricket, and outside their house, like you must have been, many of you might be playing cricket outside the house in the lane, and they noticed that there was one house or one building which was in very poor condition, dilapidated condition, and therefore children used to call it a haunted house because nobody lived there. But then these people were very much interested in that house. They were praising the architecture, they were talking about the wood carvings, and even they said that they are going to write to the minister so that the required steps could be taken to maintain that building and to preserve the beauty of that building. Now, these children were worried why this building has to be preserved. This is an haunted house, and the condition is also very pathetic. So there are two sets of people. One group of people say that all buildings and houses should be preserved back because that is the heritage of our country. We come to know a lot about the times when those houses were not vacant. People used to live, about their lifestyle and all. But then there is other set of people who have the perception that since the population in the country is increasing, for the development of the country, these old buildings are should not be there, they should be removed. You can have your own opinion regarding this. Okay, you must have seen that if you have gone to your great grandmother's house or something like this, you must have noticed that they have the doors, they had some different types of carvings on it. The if you talk about these ancient buildings, if you visit them, you will notice that they are very much different to the buildings and houses where we are living right now. Okay, so let's begin the story now. The story of Harappa. Very often, old buildings have a story to tell. Nearly 150 years ago, when railway lines were being laid down for the first time in Punjab, engineers stumbled upon the site of Harappa in present day Pakistan. To them, it seemed like a mound that was a rich source of ready made, high quality bricks. So they carried off thousands of bricks from the walls of the old buildings of the city to build railway lines. Many buildings were completely destroyed. So when the Britishers were ruling our country, they had started the beginning of the railway construction. They introduced these railways to our country, and that time when these people were constructing, they were not aware, so they noticed that stumble, that means they found that there was huge mound which had bricks in it, and the quality of the brick was very good. So what they did was they used those bricks in building the railway tracks, constructing it. because they were not aware that it should be preserved. Then, about 80 years ago, archaeologists found the site and realized that this was one of the oldest cities in the subcontinent, as this was the first city to be discovered. All other cities from where similar buildings and other things were found were described as Harappan. These cities developed about 4,700 years ago. So, like just 80 years back, archaeologists have found this site, and then they realized that this is the oldest city which is there in the subcontinent. And we are talking about the time period as this was the first city and it was to be discovered, and it was named as Harappa. The cities, when they have noticed that this part is in like the rail where the construction of railways was being done was in Pakistan. So remember, it they are talking about before partition. So Pakistan was a part of our country that time. Very often old buildings are pulled down to make way for new construction. Do you think it is important to preserve old buildings? We have already discussed this. What was special about these cities? Many of these cities were divided into two or more parts. Usually, the part to the west was smaller but higher. Archaeologists describe this as citadel. So, you can see that the cities have been divided into two parts, and the part which was on the west side, but in size it was smaller but on the higher position, and archaeologists describe it as citadel. Generally, the part to the east was larger but lower. This was called the lower town. Very often, walls of baked bricks were built around each part. The brick were so well baked that they have lasted for thousands of years. The bricks were laid in an interlocking pattern, and that made the walls strong. So, the quality of bricks we have already discussed in that paragraph, that the quality of brick was very good. That's why even after so many years they retained, they were intact and were used in making the railway tracks. So you can understand that the quality, it was very good, and they used the pattern that was interlocking. I'll send you the picture of interlocking pattern so that you can understand it. In some cities, special buildings were constructed on the citadel. For example, in Mohenjo-Daro, a very special tank which archaeologists called the Great Bath was built in this area. This was lined with bricks, coated with plaster, and made watertight with a layer of natural tar. There were steps leading down to it from two sides, while there were rooms on all sides. Water was probably brought in from a well and drained out after use. Perhaps important people took a dip in this tank on special occasions. You can understand this great bath. It is like similar to the swimming pool which we have nowadays, but the difference is that now the science has developed so much. But in that time, how they maintained it, that the water came from the well, it was there, and it didn't leaked out. People used to take bath in it. Some special people used to take bath in it on or some auspicious occasions, and there were rooms around it so that they can it could be used for changing and all or like changing or maybe other purposes. So they had the provision of letting that water enter it, and after use or when it was untidy, that water was released and fresh water entered the great bath. Okay, you can see the map. Mohenjo-Daro is there. Then you can see Harappa, Kalibangan, Ganeriwala, Chunhudaro, Dholavira, Lothal. We will be studying about these places as well. Then yes, you can see that there were steps through which was used for people to go down where the water was there. Perhaps important people took dip in the tank. Other cities such as Kalibangan and Lothal had fire altars. where sacrifices may have been performed, and some cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and Lothal had elaborate storehouses. That means they grew a lot of grains and they kept the leftovers for some emergency purposes. Fire altars, you can say that maybe they were performing some sort of yajnas or religious purposes. Therefore, these fire altars were used. Houses, streets, drains. Generally, houses were either 1 or 2 stories high with rooms built around a courtyard. Most houses had a separate bathing area and some had wells to supply water. So, you can see that there were either 1 story or 2 story houses. The rooms were built around a courtyard and they had separate bathing area, like separate area where they could take bath, like nowadays also we have different, like separate washrooms. Then they had wells, their own wells for supply of water. Many of these cities had covered drains. That means they were living in a very hygienic condition. Notice how carefully these were laid out in straight line. Although you cannot see it, each drain had a gentle slope so that water could flow through it. Very often, drains in the houses were connected to those on the streets and smaller drains led into bigger ones. So, there were drains which were covered and the drains were in the straight line. The reason was that the water could flow easily, that is why. Then they were covered, it is not visible just like this. So, it was like properly covered and the smaller drains, they were connected with the drains which were there on the streets. As the drains were covered, inspection holes were provided at intervals to clean them. So, you can see how properly they lived. There were inspection holes so that they can keep a check on the drains and could be cleaned easily from at different time levels. All three houses, drains and streets were probably planned and built at the same time. List at least 2 differences between the houses described here and those that you studied about in chapter 2. So, just jot down the differences and we can you can just share it on the give the answers online. Okay class, one more thing I would like to tell you here, that the streets were built in such a way that they were at the right angles. The reason was that streets could be cleaned automatically when the wind will blow. So, that was the purpose. So, you can understand that how far-sighted those people were who lived in that in the Harappan period. That's all for today class. Please go through the chapter, see the pictures. If you have any query, please don't hesitate in sending it to me. Be at home, take care of yourselves. Thank you class.